Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Dooovid, let's just talk a little bit in a nutshell of where you're coming from. You came to my attention because you were involved in a three-way talk with E. Michael Jones, who's been a regular guest of mine over time. And so let's start there. Talk a little bit, Dooovid, about your process and what brought you to who you are.
Okay, well, I'm Dooovid from Detroit. I became a Baal Teshuva young at 18. I went to Israel. I'd been kind of a secular Jew from a mixed marriage, bar mitzvah reform. 18, I went to Israel, became born again. I became ultra Orthodox, like Hasidic. I ended up in Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem and then serving famous Hasidic rabbis. I lived in Brooklyn for 10 years. I'd always had conservative leanings. And, so I studied to be a rabbi, but practically it didn't work out, as a profession. So I ended up in University of Michigan, property management, civil engineering. But my passion is Judaism. I studied Daf Yomi, Talmud, very involved. And, the last year I got involved in streaming, and I kind of found a niche in debating the JQ, taking the positive side in the JQ. And I think my special niche in that is generally I'm very defensive of Jews in general, where I don't, even though I'm personally conservative, where I don't just defend conservative Jews, I'll defend the position of Jews at large in our effect in Western society, even to liberal Jews, although I'm personally quite conservative.
I've noticed recently, since I've been getting involved in YouTube and doing this, hosting this channel, that there is a new flock of young, nice-looking guys, YouTube hosts who have huge followings, people like Adam Green and Ryan Dawson, who are, for whatever reason, however they arrived at it, they're virulently anti-Israel. And in the case of Adam Green, he's into a lot of Jewish conspiracy theories around Israel as being the catalyst for world war and rebellion. And a lot of this idea seems to dovetail with the work of E. Michael Jones, who is a scholar that I have always admired. He's been a guest of mine many times. He wrote some extraordinary books about culture. The horror genre is a brilliant book, Degenerate Moderns. He wrote this huge book called Libido Dominandi, which is about how the sexual revolution has been used as a way to control people, which I thought was an incredibly interesting thesis. And then I fell upon his book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, which he sent me. That was nice enough to do so, but which I found to embrace very, I guess you'd say, Orthodox Christian and Catholic views that are anti-Jewish. He's not anti-Semitic, as he points out, because that's a construct that deals with race. It's more just that he's against the Jewish religion, which he reviews as a false theology, as a false construct, and as a reaction to a rejection of Jesus as Messiah. And thus he views Jews as being subversive and in rebellion and behind every rebellion in history in the Western world ever since. What do you make of his thesis?
Well, I mean, I'd say two things. One thing I'd point out, it seems to me that ignorance is the natural condition, and people take information and process it in different ways. I have also a big interest in consciousness and how the brain performs thought. And to me, I look at anti-Semites generally as rational actors, just based off the information that they have in making decisions. And also I have a large interest in history and realizing how authors over pre-World War II wrote about things. So, saying E. Michael Jones is largely in line with the vast tradition of scholars pre-World War II. And I'm not sure how I'd classify his beliefs. I mean, personally, I would agree with him in many aspects because I look at the Jews as a spiritual force. I could discuss things in a more secular manner, but I prefer to look things at a spiritual way. And So I enjoy his literature. He made me pay full price for his book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. That's why I don't have more of his books, because they're
Yeah.
very expensive, and even clipped me, joking about not giving me a discount. Um, but like I somewhat specialize in interfaith and in biblical verses, and I think you have to respect what he's saying, that saying he's not telling you, like my rabbis would say, like he's not telling you what he thinks. He's telling you what the Bible says. He's telling you what the sages over thousands of years has said, and only post World War II that has changed. And from that respect, I would agree with him.
Well, first of all, I don't consider him to be an anti-Semite. I think that because he points out that anti-Semitism was a construct that came out of the late 19th century that deals with race. It's like the Jews as a race, because that's how the late 19th century so-called Enlightenment thinkers were looking at the world. They were dividing the world up in terms of racial categories. And that his contention is that he's anti-Jewish in the traditional Christian and Catholic sense. And I respect that opinion. I simply would argue that it's wrong. It starts with the premise that the Jews of ancient Judea, which he calls Palestine, which it's not, it was Judea at the time, were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, which the more I look at that subject, the more I realize that they had probably nothing to do with it. But from that event, he then claims that the Jews developed an entirely different religion that is not consistent with the Torah, true Judaism, which is based on the Talmud. And I also think that's wrong, because the Talmud is entirely based on the Torah. The Talmud is commentary on the Torah. The Talmud does not contradict the Torah. And to kind of try to claim that the Talmud is somehow inventing a new religion is just historically inaccurate.
Well, if you want the kind of scholarship and the Talmudic pilpul of the different thoughts, because obviously Judaism changed after the destruction of the temple, and we went from a temple cult with a somewhat caste system of Kohanim and Levites and tithes and having to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times a year, to rabbinic Judaism. So the Talmud is obviously the rabbis doing the best with the situation that we had. Today is Lag BaOmer, the celebration of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the star disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who helped make that transition after the destruction of the temple. And so from that respect, the religion did change. I don't think the rabbis invented it, as saying just we weren't capable of operating the way we used to when the temple existed. And I told E. Michael Jones this in our conversation. If you want to say, okay, you think he's wrong because you think Christianity is a false religion, and as Maimonides said, he's one of the few rabbis who said, yes, we did put Jesus Christ to death, and he deserved it. If you're familiar with the disputations like Yechiel Maperis and Nachmanides, who basically rejected that we had put Christ to death, or even rejected that he existed at all, Maimonides said he was a false prophet and he deserved to die. That's the penalty that Moses gave. So I'm not sure what criteria you're putting. You're just saying you're a typical Jew who thinks Christianity is a false religion, or are you saying something different about E. Michael Jones beyond your rejection of Christianity?
Well, I guess that from what you're saying, the question of whether or not the Jews are responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus is disputed within Jewish circles. I mean, you have rabbis who have argued both sides. I'm simply looking at it historically and saying that the fact is that the Romans crucified Jesus. The Jews in Judea at that time didn't have the authority to crucify anybody. They were not in power. Pompey, the Roman general, took over the temple, desecrated the temple about maybe 40, 50 years before Jesus was born. And Jews had effectively lost sovereignty in Judea. So the only power that had the authority to crucify anybody was the Roman government. And it was the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who tried Jesus, passed sentence of death, and executed Jesus. So that's just a fact of history. Now, whether or not the Jews wanted him to be executed, whether or not they colluded with him, that's something that I just don't think that's ever going to be fully known in history. There were people, the Romans were crucifying people left and right at that time. So, I don't know if they did. I mean, and I also think that as Michael Jones referred me to reading a passage in the New Testament, which I don't exactly remember why he wanted me to read it, but what it led me to do was to read the portions of the New Testament, and particularly the dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees, who were the rabbinic rabbis of that time. And it seems to me pretty clear that he was operating entirely within the tradition of Pharisaic Judaism, which goes back hundreds of years before. It didn't just happen as a result of the destruction of the temple. They had already developed, schools of education, and they'd already developed an alternative system because temple worship was often in the hands of enemies. And that, in a sense, this continued after the destruction. They certainly functioned during the period of no temple between the first and second temple. So Jones's contention, which is traditional Catholic, that Judaism no longer existed because we didn't have a temple, that's historically false. We existed before the temple, we existed in between the two temples, and we continued to exist after the temple. The actual animal sacrifice is not critical to Jewish faith and Jewish observance. We pray for the rebuilding of the temple, but nevertheless, we have a means by which to worship and to pray and to function with things that represent temple worship in abeyance of the existence of the temple. But to get back, Jesus's dialogues between himself and the Pharisees indicate to me that he was a Pharisaic rabbi himself. He was well versed in Talmudic, what would become known as Talmudic Judaism, and his arguments were entirely on the page of what was standard argument. And when I look at those arguments, I would agree with Jesus. I mean, the Pharisees were way up, they were focusing, as a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews do today, and other Jews, even, versions of it in the secular community. They're focusing on minutia and on dancing around on the top of a pin and missing the broader picture of the moral and ethical code of Sinai and its application to existence. I mean, and that was the bulk of his complaint about the Pharisees, and he was right. And the Pharisees, some of them agreed with him and some of them didn't. Apparently, Rabbi Gamliel, who was a major religious figure at that time, was sent out to meet Jesus as a part of a delegation by the Pharisees, and he came back and he was impressed with him. I mean, so, it was a controversial figure, but the point is that his arguments are entirely consistent with what we now call Talmudic Judaism, and that the Talmud was basically the codification of some of these ideas, because it became clear to Rabbi Judah Nazi that Israel would not be regaining its sovereignty in Judea after the destruction at the defeat of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so he thus codified the Talmud. He put it into writing, the Mishnah, because he could see that we needed to govern ourselves effectively until the time when we could regain sovereignty. And that's what the Talmud is. It's nothing more than the governing documents of Judaism in practice. It's a practice of Torah. What say you?
I love Talmud. I studied Daf Yomi. In fact, God willing, I'm going to finish my first time through Talmud at the end of this year with the Daf Yomi cycle. I was in ultra-Orthodox yeshivas for multiple years and studied Talmud all day for at least 3 years of my life. And just to push back on what you were saying, if you want to take, Maimonides has the hard, clearly writing in the Laws of King. I mean, we could go over the text that Jesus did in fact deserve death. That was accurate, even though the Jews didn't have the ability to carry out the death penalty ourselves. That it was a just court decision that gave him the death penalty. And according to the false prophet, and it's in Exodus 20, the verses are very clear that the punishment for a false prophet is death, or someone that tries to lead the people astray. And also, like the Pharisees, if you take the Talmudic tradition, the Pharisees, if Jesus was a Pharisee, and it's very difficult to speculate on the historical Jesus, that the Pharisees were in a very low position, according to the Talmudic rabbinic history. After the Hashmonaim in the Hanukkah story had taken over Israel, 2 generations later, they took over the kingship, which was forbidden because they were priests. And so to say, the Pharisees, this was the creation of the Pharisees, that you can't do that. You're a priest, that the kingship is reserved for the descendants of David. And there's a story in the Talmud where on Sukkot, they pelted the high priest with their esrogs. And according to the Talmud, the king of Israel, the Hashmonaim, the descendant of
The
Judah
Maccabees. That's right.
slaughtered 6,000 sages, crucified them, and had their wives and children killed in front of them while they were dying on the cross. And then Herod also, when he becomes king, the Talmudic story is very interesting, that it's kind of, the Talmud makes it look like Herod was kind of ordained by God, where Herod was a slave in the house of the Hashmonaim, and he hears this voice from heaven that says, any slave that kills his master will be forgiven, and then he kills the whole royal family and wears the priestly and the royal garments, and somehow that's enough that all of a sudden he's king. And then Herod also slaughters all of the sages except for one. In the Talmud, there's an interesting story where he kept one sage alive that he had blinded, and he keeps on as his advisor, and he tries to intermarry within the former royal family. But the Pharisees were on an extreme down and out of the extent that it was basic civil war between the Jews at that time, and the Pharisees had almost no power, and the Pharisees who were trying to raise up and saying you're not properly following Judaism, they were at risk of death as much from their fellow Jews who were in power than from the Romans. So if Jesus was a Pharisee, in the stories in the New Testament, I've read the New Testament, and I'm a big subscriber to the teachings of Jesus. I promote the teachings of Jesus. I think they're good for the world, just like I reject that he was Messiah. I mean, obviously.
Well, that's the question. And also, you bring up some really interesting history. A lot of this was written about by Josephus, in that the Hasmonean dynasty, which was the family of the Judah Maccabee, they had become corrupted by the Sadducees. They had usurped the kingdom at a time when Israel was independent and prosperous, and it was the whole Jewish enterprise was evolving forward. And as you say, Alexander Yanai did execute and crucify the sages. And Herod then, of course, usurped the throne as well. He was the half-Jewish. He was the son of a slave. He was a puppet of the Roman emperor at the time, who was Octavian, who installed him. And that he married the final surviving Hasmonean princess and then had her killed along with her children, his own children. Very evil man, really seen as an insane figure in both New Testament and Jewish sources.
Although the builder of the wall
he built the wall that we now, he was a great builder. He built the Herodion. He built, he basically ruled Israel in that sense quite powerfully. And also that Jesus was born at the time that Herod was, I think, still claiming to be the usurper of the throne. But to bring things up to a little bit more current.
If I can make a quick point in that, if from the Judeo perspective, the Bible talks in a language where the Jewish people go astray and we're led by sin, and then God himself will raise up a foreign power in order to punish us. In the words of the prophets in the time of the first temple, when we had gone astray, that God rises up Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians or the Persians. And the Talmud describes Herod in that manner, that the Hasmoneim, that Herod was basically risen up by God in order to punish the Hasmoneim. And if you take that, I debated Patrick Little. If you take that similar perspective till today, where anti-Semitism is the vehicle that God uses against his own people, if you have a true believer's perspective, and I'm not sure if you look at it that way or you agree that that's basically the religious way to interpret Judaism.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I'm not in a position to agree or disagree. I know that there are some very Orthodox Jews who view the Holocaust as a punishment against the Jews because we had become infiltrated by the ultra heretical Sabbatian Frankist movement.
I would
Um,
say, unfortunately, all of the sages, besides for the Lubavitch Rebbe, including the Lubavitch Rebbe's father, I mean, because it takes a Job type position that God is just. So if this happened, if someone suffers like Job and his friends that saw Job suffering said, well, it has to be, God forbid Job is a sinner because if Job is suffering and God is a just God, it must be that Job's punishment for the sin that he deserves is the suffering that he has. And so basically all of the sages, from history throughout the Holocaust have basically said that unfortunately that's the punishment for sin. And when I first got to Israel, the rabbis, blew my mind. The rabbis said, God forbid, I mean, even the words leaving my mouth are kind of scary. Like, yes, we deserve the Holocaust, and it's because we violated Sabbath. We broke the laws. And if you look in Moses, unfortunately, the curses in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, they're extremely serious. That unfortunately, none of the bad things that have befallen the Jewish people are out of line with the punishments that are explicitly laid down in Moses for violating the commandments.
well, look, I mean, these are questions that only God knows. But what I would say is this: if you take a look at what we call the Torah and the writings and the prophets, it's basically a struggle within the Jewish community, a spiritual struggle between the forces that want to know God and follow his moral and ethical precepts, and those who want to descend into idol worship and paganism. And that it was this cult, if you will, started by Abraham, that was the first cult to really recognize that there is a supreme being and that man doesn't create God, God creates man. And that it's that struggle within Judaism that permeates the entire Torah, and that when the Jews knew God and worshiped God, they were holy and they had prosperity and success. And when they fell away from God, they would be punished. So what you're saying is consistent with that view. And I want to get into the business of the Sabbatian heresy. But before we go there, I just want to finish up by talking about the Talmud and how it is portrayed in religious Christian circles. And in Michael Jones's book on the Jewish spirit to prove that Jews are in rebellion, in that he points to a Jewish heretic in the Middle Ages named Nicholas Donin, who approached the Pope and said, the Talmud says that Jesus is boiling in excrement for eternity in hell.
And Nicholas Donin is the one that debates Yehilma Paris. And it was an interesting story. I mentioned kind of Luke Ford. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Rabbi Weil, who's now the head of the Orthodox Union, who had kind of excommunicated Luke Ford. But according to tradition, Nicholas Donin was under the auspices of Yehilma Paris, who was the chief rabbi of Paris. And he had had a bunch of questions as a kid and ends up getting excommunicated, kicked out of the Jewish circles by Yehilma Paris, and then converts to Christianity, and then comes back to debate Yehilma Paris and forcefully, the Jewish community to answer all of these questions, leading to the burning of the Talmud and the expulsion of the Jews from Paris in that area. But it's interesting in the story, you point out the Talmud that you mentioned Rabbi Gamliel, although it's unclear if that refers to Jesus. There's some understanding that some people say it was Hillel, but that Jesus was a disciple of Rabbi Gamliel, and he was saying his Shema or prayer, and Jesus was coming to him, and like he waves his hand, saying like, "Come, wait a second." But Jesus interpreted it to say like, "Go away, you're not wanted here," and that's where he goes on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that interpretation of the Talmud, but similarly with Nicholas Donin to say, you got to be careful about kicking people out and excommunicating. Had Yehilma Paris not had such a strong hand in kicking out Nicholas Donin as a young kid for having so many questions, this whole episode probably would never have happened.
Interesting. And also, Nicholas Donin is one of these people that occasionally props up through history where they not only are either excommunicated or they leave Judaism, but they look back with anger and they attack after having left. I mean, Torquemada was one of the chief inquisitors of the Spanish Inquisition, a former Jew. And, you know, they all of a sudden become extremely zealous in their persecution of Jews. Now, I want to get into the substance of this, though, because a lot of the stuff that Nicholas Donin presented to King Louis of France, which led him to burn 15 crates of Talmuds in the front of Notre Dame Cathedral and ban and excommunicate and ban all Jews from France, it had this passage about Jesus burning an excrement in hell.
It's Unclus's conversion story.
Well, let me talk about that. Let me also, it had, there were other things that were ascribed to the Talmud, like that Mary was a whore that had been raped by a Roman general named Pantheus, and that these other really, really nasty, unpleasant things that Donin claimed were in the Talmud. First of all, my understanding is that the whole business of Jesus's birth and all of that stuff, that was not in the Talmud. That was in this book called Toldot Jesher, which is a book of Jesus. It was a very bad book, but it was not Talmud. It was, read by Jews. It was like a novel, and it was written in the early centuries of the Common Era. And that this was at a time when both Judaism and Christianity, as an early faith, the Ebionites, it was even before they had become identified as Christian, were in a fierce struggle. And in fact, it was Christians who convinced the Emperor Trajan to not allow the Jews to rebuild the temple, because they, in other words, there was a lot of internecine warfare going on. And thus you had nasty things being written on both sides. On the Christian side, and Michael Jones documents this as well, in a sense he's praising it, you had St. John Chrysostom issue a pamphlet where he referred to Jewish women as whores, and the men are effeminate, and they'll corrupt your families, and don't associate with them. And that pamphlet flew around the Roman Empire like it was an email. I mean, it was huge. And there were other early church fathers who were involved in this kind of stuff. So I only point this out to mention that even if these things were in the Talmud, and I would highly dispute that either way, it has to be viewed in the context of the times, which was that there was enormous anger and tension between the two faiths, and that there were nasty things said.
That could be what I'm saying. We're not going to figure that pardon me. We're not going to be able to figure that out. The Talmud's been censored. The historical Jesus, it's almost no chance the new records, maybe when Messiah comes, these questions will be answered. So, pardon me.
That's right.
And I enjoy researching it. And
there's an old joke in Israel that says that when the Messiah comes and he's standing up at the top of the Mount of Olives and he's looking down, ready to descend into Jerusalem, the Israelis are going to send out a delegation to greet him and say, "Welcome to our country," shake his hand. "So tell us, is this your first visit or is it a return visit?" And then we'll know. And if it was a return visit, we'll worship Jesus. But the point is, we don't know. This is only something that's going to be revealed at the time of the Moshiach, however that happens.
I enjoy I'm not sure your position on it. I mean, typically you take, the Jews were looking for, so to say, the conquering Messiah, and Jesus turns out to be the suffering Messiah. And I'm open to those interpretations, saying that the reason why Jesus has lasted all these generations is this concept of suffering on behalf of others. And other Kabbalists and the sages will accept the premise of the Jesus principle that this concept of suffering on behalf of others is one of the most profound altruism concepts that has ever entered humanity. And then to deify it, of all the idols a person could deify, to deify someone that suffers on behalf of others is pretty profound. And kind of now you have the strong state of Israel, and obviously Maimonides living in Arab territories could have had the less apologetic attitude and think, I'm sorry, that's a false idol. You might kill me, you might torture me, I'll accept my lot, but I'm here to inform you that that's a false idol.
Mm-hmm. I tend to embrace the dual covenant idea. I don't know about you, but I mean, first of all, it was Jesus himself who was attributed as having stated in the book of Matthew and repeated in the book of Acts that the covenant between Moses and the Jewish people is forever. And forever means forever. Jesus was a devout Jew. Now, in the 18th century, you had Rabbi Jacob Emden, who was one of the major figures fighting the Sabbateans in their influence in Judaism. And he reevaluated Jesus. Up until that point, Jews generally, we were proud of Jesus because he was a Jew and because he brought the Torah to the world and he led this incredible, religion. And I think there was a general sense of pride over him. But we also viewed him as a renegade. And it was Rabbi Emden who began to reevaluate and say, and come to the opinion that Jesus was a devout Jew his entire life, right up to the moment he died. He believed he was the Messiah, and he did so in a sense that was not necessarily contradictory to Jewish understanding, but he was a devout Jew, and that this whole business of the Son of God and the God and all that stuff, that came later. That was kind of a Greek idea, in a sense, the whole idea of the demigod and all of this. But that brings me to just, the thought went out of my head here. There's so much going on.
If you're thinking like the positive outlook of, the typical Kabbalistic understanding today that's kind of accepted among Jews is, you have 36 hidden tzaddikim, righteous people of every generation, right, and one person who has the soul of Messiah. And if Messiah comes in that generation, it would have been that person. And what the origins of it might go back quite a bit of time. It's possible that it's always been the understanding of Judaism. And then you want to look back and you're saying, is it possible that Jesus had the soul of Messiah, and had Messiah came in that generation, it would have been him, in the same way that a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews would say that about the Lubavitch Rebbe. You had the Lubavitch Rebbe obviously was the best candidate for Messiah in the last generation, and maybe even Shabbatai Tzvi, that a lot of later sages say, okay, obviously he converted to Islam and wasn't Messiah and he died, but that pretty clearly he had the soul of Messiah. I mean, the Baal Shem Tov starts that with the story of the Or HaChaim HaKodesh that was in Israel, the Sephardi interpreter of the Torah, that when he died, that the soul of Messiah went from the Or HaChaim to the Baal Shem Tov, and till the progression of that. So I don't know the origins of that concept, but I think that's pretty mainstream within Judaism, or if anyone would be willing to apply that to say, yes, maybe Jesus was the potential Messiah, right, but clearly he failed to fulfill all of the visions that are required.
But I think that the reason I say that I support the idea of the dual covenant is that whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, the fact is that his ministry has caused the bringing forth of the Torah and the moral and ethical code of the Torah to a large portion of the world. So that at least makes him messianic. And to that reason, I think that while the Jewish covenant between God and Moses remains, and that we remain true to that covenant, you could argue that Jesus did represent a new covenant for the non-Jewish world. And it was a grafting in of Torah principles and belief in God and all of everything that had gone forth into and made available to the non-Jewish world, which brings me to the thought that just came back here. Rashi was asked, and I don't have documents on this, but I've read this, whether or not Christians, and in his day that meant Catholics, were idol worshippers. And it was something that he thought about and studied for many, many years. And eventually, toward the end of his life, he came out with the decision that they were not idol worshippers, that the fact that they might have images in their churches and statues, these are not idols. in the sense that idol worshiping existed in pagan times, where it wasn't so much the graven image, but it was all the immoral practices that were conducted around the graven image. And this idea that the graven image was God and that man could create God with his own hands, that in that sense, Christianity is not involved in idol worship. And I think this is something that is a misunderstanding, both among Christians who accuse Jews of believing this, and among a lot of Jews who think that we're supposed to believe this. But, in fact, that's not the case. What say you?
Yeah, but I think in two quick points. One is the dispute between the Ramban, Nachmanides, and Maimonides about dispensationalism, where Nachmanides holds that after the temple was destroyed and we basically instituted rabbinic Judaism and prayer to replace sacrifices, that that's just a memorial placeholder till we eventually go back to the temple service, as opposed to Maimonides looks at more dispensationally as kind of prayers replacing sacrifices, that at one point God had needed sacrifices, and then the dispensation changes to prayer, and that's dispute within Judaism till today. And then also Maimonides puts Muhammad in the Quran in the same light as Jesus, and saying that eventually there will be a Messiah that will come and will fulfill the prophecies, and the world will be looking. They'll recognize Messiah because of God forbid, say, the false religions of Christianity and Islam. And Maimonides uses the language, they'll realize their ancestors made a small error, so that a Christian or a Muslim, when the true Messiah comes, will just be like, oh, my parents were basically right, my ancestors were basically right, but they just made a small error, and then they'll be able to change their ways and fall in line with the true Messiah.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. I mean, this is why Maimonides is so revered in the world. I mean, he was admired by Muslims. He was a personal doctor to Salah ad-Din, who was the head of the Egyptian Muslim state at that time. He also was a major influencer over St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a major Catholic thinker at that time. So he kind of had his ideas.
He knew Greek philosophy. I mean, he was the...
That's right.
He transferred was the Jewish Renaissance man. The European scholars generally reject scholasticism, as opposed to Maimonides, who was Aristotelian and believed that all wisdom was worthy of learning, which obviously is not the dominant view of Orthodox Jews today.
That's another subject, and that's interesting. But Dooovid, I don't want to continue too much today, because I like to keep my YouTube videos within an hour time. But this is such an interesting conversation that I want to do a series with you. We need to talk about Kabbalah. I want to talk about Shabtai Zvi. I want to talk about Israel. I want to talk about Jewish Bolshevism. I want to talk about all of it and get your opinion. You've got a lot of knowledge, and I appreciate that. It's great having you on today.
Just a quick word, if we do
a
show on that. I think Shabbatai Tzvi basically is the vehicle through which the Arizal's Kabbalah was spread throughout Europe, and is the unifying factor. So even if you take a negative view on him from a Torah perspective, that Shabbatai Tzvi unified European Jewry, and the newer revelations of the Arizal's Kabbalah had brought those teachings all across Europe. And in many respects, Shabbatai Tzvi is basically the first major Zionist in creates this concept of Jews in mass returning to Israel.
I couldn't disagree with you more. I think he was an evil man who brought a corruption and a poison into the Jewish veins.
That might also be true, but
yeah, one that, and I don't
save that for a different show. But I do want to mention that for a different.
Yeah, we'll save that for another time. But Dooovid, do you want to mention at this time how people can reach you, or websites, or anything you'd like to talk about?
I have a YouTube page. Like, as of now, I usually just go by Dooovid because I get a lot of trolls. I created my YouTube page actually originally to promote a synagogue in Detroit, the last synagogue left in Detroit because the Jews moved out to the suburbs after the '67 revolution riots, and the synagogue eventually got overran through democratic processes through progressive liberals. So my services were kind of deemed not needed in terms of teaching people Torah
Gotcha.
and how to say the prayers in Hebrew. But my YouTube page was originally created to teach people the basics of Judaism, and then I just ended up all these different activities that just being on the scene in Detroit, I ended up involved in. And so you could find me on YouTube, Dooovid. I have a whole bunch of all types of videos on all different types of subjects. And, I appear on other people's channels a lot for these type discussions, but I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you reaching out to me. As I said, I had seen your videos over the last, year that I've been involved in these YouTube chats, and thanks for having me on. Hopefully we'll talk more about these subjects.
No, I'd like to. I'd like to do an ongoing series. There's a lot to go over here. Dooovid, thanks so much for joining me today.